Hello, my name is Melissa Manus, and I would like to tell you a story about Sleeping Beauty. This story is a fairy tale and is about a king, a queen, and a princess. So, once upon a time, there was a king and there was a queen. Now, this king and queen were very sad. They were so sad because they did not have a child. So then one day, they did have a child, and they were so happy. They were so happy that they decided to have a huge feast and christening for their new child. And they invited everyone from the land to come to this christening, especially the fairies. So there were 7 fairies, and they invited them to come, and they made gold plates, forks, spoons, and knives for these fairies. So when the fairies got there, they had their christening, and when it was over, they were to sit down to have their feast. And when they were just about to sit down, an old, angry fairy came in, and she had not been seen for 50 years. She had been gone. So they did not expect her to be there. So as soon as the king saw her, he immediately called on his servants and he said, "Bring her a plate, a fork, a spoon, and a knife." So the servants brought her one, and as soon as she got it, she realized it's not gold, for the king did not have time to furnish a plate, a fork, a spoon, and a knife out of gold. So she was angry at this, and she sat here and she mumbled and she grumbled about this. So then the fairy that sat next to her, which was the youngest and the wisest of them, decided to hide because she knew that when it was time to give their gifts for the new princess, that she may give a bad gift, and she wanted to make sure that she could be after her to maybe change what her gift is. So then it was time for the fairies to give their gifts. And everyone crowded around as the fairies came one at a time. So the first one came up, and she said, "You will be the most beautiful princess in the world." And she went away. And then the second one came up, and she said, "You shall have the temper of an angel." And she went away. And the third one came up, and she said, "She shall have a wonderful grace in all that she does and all that she says." And she went away. And the fourth one came up, and she said, "She shall sing as a nightingale." And she went away. And the fifth one came up, and she said, "She shall dance and just like a flower in the wind." And she went away. And finally, the sixth one came up. She said, "She shall play music that has never been heard across this earth, and it shall be the most beautiful music ever heard." She went away. Then it was time for the angry old fairy's wish. She said, "When she turns the age of 17, she shall prick her finger on a spindle, and she shall die." And she went away. The king and the queen started to tremble, and they started to sob. They were so sad by this news. "What are we going to do?" the queen said. "Oh," said the king, and the youngest fairy of them all came behind the curtain, and she came up to the king and the queen, and she said, "Please don't cry, don't be sad, for I cannot change what my sister has done. But she will not die." She said, "She will still prick her finger at the age of 17 on a spindle, but she will not die. Instead, she shall sleep for 100 years and then be woken up by a king's son." And all the fairies vanished away. The king, so upset by this, told everyone, commanded that all of the spindles be burned, and they should be burned until there are no more in the land. So all the spindles were burned in the land. But there was one little lady who did not hear. She was very old and very deaf, and she did not hear the king's command. So when the princess turned 17, she was left alone. Her parents had went off and left her alone in the castle, and she was wandering around, looking around, and she got to the tallest tower in the castle where this woman was sitting, spinning on the spindle. So the princess comes up and she says, "What are you doing?" And the lady says, "I am spinning, my pretty dear." And she says, "How do you do that? What is this?" And so she said, "Can I try?" And the lady gave her the spindle. And whenever she took it, she immediately pricked her finger and fell asleep. The old woman saw this and she cried for help. "Help! Help! Come help! She's fallen asleep." And they came and they could see that there was nothing that they could do, for she was asleep. And the fairy heard this and she came and she started to use her wand on everybody except for the king and the queen. And she touched everybody with her wand and made them fall asleep just as they were doing what they were doing. All of the gentlemen, all of the ladies, all of the grooms for horses, even the horses themselves fell asleep on the land around the castle. And the king and the queen, she did this because she was afraid that the princess, after sleeping for 100 years, would be frightened when she woke up. And she wanted to make sure that everything was the same when she woke up. So the king and the queen then departed from the castle, and they commanded that no one should enter, no one should go into this castle while their daughter was in there sleeping. So they didn't need to worry about this command though, because then a huge woods grew around the castle and it covered all of the castle and no one could get through it. No one could get through this castle. So then 100 years has went by. The king has already died. He had no more children. So then another royal family took over and a new king was in place. So then that new king's son was going hunting one day and he came along and he was hunting and he saw great tall towers in the distance. And he asked one of his fellow companions, he said, "What is that over there?" And the companion, nobody they knew. They didn't know what that was. They had never seen it. So they kept going and they came across a peasant. And he asked the peasant, "What are those towers over there?" And the peasant said, "My father told me 50 years ago of a story of a castle, and in that castle was the fairest, most beautiful princess in all the land in the castle sleeping, and she's going to be in there sleeping until a king's son comes to awaken her." And he went on his way. And the prince, after hearing this, was determined to find the truth. So he went and he was going through and he tried to go through the thicket and he was able to, but no one else could. And the branches moved for him and he got through the woods and he came upon the castle and he climbed up into the golden chamber in this tower and he saw the princess. And she was the most fairest princess he had ever seen. And he came up to her and he kissed her on the cheek. And when he did, as soon as he did, she woke up. And she said, "Is it you, my prince? I have waited so long for you." And they were so happy, and everyone immediately started to wake up out of the sleep, starting to do what they were already doing, the horses being where they were at, the grooms for the horses kept on grooming. The ladies, the men who were bowing, they would continue to bow. Anything that they were doing when they fell asleep, they continued to do when they woke up just now, 100 years later. And everybody was so joyous. And the lady in waiting, the chief lady in waiting, whenever she woke up, she thought she was dying of hunger. And she came up to the princess and she said, "Supper is ready," anxiously, because she was so hungry. So they go down to this feast and they all eat their feast. And that night, the prince and the princess were married, and they decided to go and live in his father's castle, and they lived happily ever after.